giants of Florida. They stood over 100 feet in the air, were over 20 foot in diameter, a lot of them. The Spanish was in awe of them when they first saw them, lining the banks of the St. John's and the other tributaries in Florida. It's called a ball cypress because it's flat on the top when it gets to maturity, with no hardly any limbs in it anywhere below the very crown of the tree. They grew as far north as Delaware, along the coast down through Florida and over to Texas, and up the Mississippi River Valley as far as southern Illinois. The greatest stands of them were in Louisiana and Florida. They started cutting these trees after the timber played out up in the Great Lakes area. And Mr. Wilson came down here to Palatka, Florida, to go on a vacation, Mr. A.E. Wilson and his brother. They saw Mr. Tillman's mill in Palatka. A very small mill had been started in 1884. And this approximately the area that you're looking at right here in this topographical drawing, actually, of Palatka. It's not a photograph. As many cities in Florida had these maps drawn of them to sell to the people residing in the area at that time. Tillman's mill was very small. It only produced about 500,000 board feet of lumber a month, which is not very much in considering the mill that's going to follow it. Wilson and them became intrigued with the mill, and because, as I say, their lumber was beginning to play out up in the Great Lakes area. And they had their eye looking to the south then, where the big stands of cypress and pine were all over the south. They went in and talked to Mr. Tillman and bought half interest in the mill in 1891 and changed the name of it to Tillman and Wilson. In 1893, they purchased Tillman's share of the mill, and it changed the name of it in the next year to the Wilson Cypress Company, which would eventually become the largest cypress company in the United States at one time. And this is Tillman's mill here. This is a very small little mill, as I said. And this is Mr. A.E. Wilson, who was president of the company and who was the principal share owner in it, with some other men that came down in this area. This was their offices right outside of the mill. You can see in the background over there, you can see the mill. These are some of the workmen. He started off, there was about 150 men that worked at the mill there in Palatka. And when they closed in 1942, there was over 1,100 people employed by Wilson Cypress Company. It was the biggest payroll in Putnam County was with this mill. The first mill burned down in 1911, the one that they got from Tillman, and it was immediately replaced and continued working. And this is the second mill we're looking at here. This is a color postcard of the mill, and it was very distinctive in appearance because the second mill contained 2 smokestacks, and you'll see in the later mill it's going to contain 3. But all the logs were brought in here at that time by water. As you can see them laying in the river here, and they were drawn up into the mill through this runway, I guess you would want to call it, that went into the mill, and it had a continuous chain that ran back and forth. And that chain had little, what they called dogs on it, that would grab the log and pick it up and drag it up into the mill. And this is just another picture of it, and you can see some other things piled up here. These are shingles. Mr. Tillman also had a shingle mill there in Palatka that we will see a picture of in just a few minutes. And this is a little bit closer up view of looking up that chute where the logs were going to be drawn up, and they were herded in there, and the men stood down there and made sure they got up and went on up into the mill, because this mill operated, and there never was a great lot of lumber cut in the mill. It was not that big a mill even then, but even though it was the second biggest one in the world at one time, and later the biggest one, it was still, the production was not that great. In total lumber that they cut at that mill was something like 57 million board feet of lumber was actually what was cut out at Palatka. This is another side view of the mill. You can see the windows are broke out in it here, and this thing is a spark suppressor. This is where they burn the residue. They didn't have no place to keep it, so they had to burn it up. Now that's all used for flowers and shrubbery and mulching. But back in those days, they burned it to get rid of it. And to keep from setting the Palatka on fire, which they almost did at one time, they had to put this screen on top of this so it would catch all the sparks and keep from blowing them over in Palatka. They set one of the churches on fire in Palatka one time and almost burnt the city down. But this did hold back most of the fire from getting out of there. The mill, just like so many of the mills in Florida and all over the South, I guess, finally burned. It burned I told you, it burned first in 1911, and then again it burned in 1929, and it was rebuilt and reopened. It stayed closed until 1932, when it was reopened again, and with the third mill, it was completely electrified. You can see a close-up of the fire that was going on, and once it gets started, it's all wood. It's nothing going to stop it. It just, with no enough water, fire departments around there to even think about stopping it. It just burned till it burned itself out. Because it was, everything around these mills was operated by fire. And so that was so easy to catch fire. Now this is the second mill. The last mill that was built there in 1929, replacing that one. And you notice it has 3 smokestacks, and that was always a gentleman told me that was one night in Palatka here that this is the way you could always identify the 2 mills. First, the one that was built in 1911 had 2 smokestacks, and this one had 3. So he says very easy to tell which is which. And you can see the chute going up in there is different, and this mill goes in a different place. And this is an overhead shot of the mill and the yards, and also the 3 bridges. Palatka had 3 bridges at this time in the early 30s. This was there's the one bridge, the old highway bridge. The second one that's being built, which would be the Soldier Sailors Memorial Bridge, and a railroad bridge. All these bridges are gone today, and a high-rise bridge replaced them. On this yard here, there was always at least 300 million board feet of lumber on the yards at all time. They had to be air dried for a year before it could be shipped out. In later years, they put in some kilns in here. Cypress does not respond too well to being kiln dried because if you get it too warm, it makes it explode. The cypress is a very rare wood in the fact that it repulses insects. And if you go along the rivers today and look at a cypress tree, you never see mistletoe growing in a cypress tree because it will not attach to it. It secretes a chemical that repulses anything that tries to grow to it. Now, it has moss in it, but the moss does not grow on the tree. Moss is an air plant that just hangs on the tree. But you'll never see mistletoe growing on a cypress tree because of the natural oil in it. The cypress today that's cut does not have that oil in it to the degree that the old cypress did, so don't expect to go out and be able to stick a cypress board in the ground that's not going to rot, because you'll be very disappointed because it has too much sapwood on it today. Now this shows you the fenders that went out into the river. These extended out 800 feet into the St. Johns River. And this is where the lumber was brought out to when it was going to be ready to be shipped. And you can see the log rafts in there, too, at the same time in the middle here. They were ready to go in. But the boats would come here and anchor out in the water, and they would load the cypress on the lighters, and they'd be pulled out to load the ships with. And this is what this one gentleman that talked to me so much did when he started off there as a boy, was to carry water to these men that was working out there. And he worked for Wilson until it closed up in 1944. Wilson Cypress Company, along with Tillman, operated about 60 years on the St. Johns River. When they rebuilt, it was an all-electric plant. everything, all the saws, everything in the plant was electric, where a lot of them before had been operated by steam. So that got rid of that, and they put in their own diesel generators, their diesel generators. As you can see, it had a very nice electrical unit to run this plant with. Here's some lithographed drawings of some of the operations at the plant there. You notice a lot of their this is coming in by train. They had a lot of holdings over in Central Florida, in Dixie and Lafayette counties. And that railroad being tipped like it was there would let the log just roll off into the water as it came in. This is one of the chutes that we were looking at earlier that's showing the cypress logs coming up and into the mill and this chute from the water. Just a better view of it from another direction. This is an 84-inch saw here. It's a cutoff saw. Now, these logs came in. They had to be cut into 16-foot lengths, because this is what you cut all lumber cut it back in those days were in 16-foot lengths, and then it was cut down to shorter ones, but it was all cut into 16-footers. And these had replaceable teeth in them, so that you didn't have to change that blade. The teeth were put in and set in with set screws, so all they had to do to redo it was just to exchange all the teeth in it. Some of the logs were so big they had to roll them to get them to cut off because they were too big. Now this saw here, I wish I had a picture of the saw in operation, but I've never been able to find one. But this is the bandsaw that sliced the big logs, to cut the boards out of the big logs. Now this saw was quite large. It was 52 foot long. It took 8 men to pick it up and haul it over to put it in this machine to be sharpened. And that's what they're doing here. This thing cost $600, and it would last them about 5 months, one of these saws would. Now, this saw would saw a 20-foot diameter log. And the gentleman that I spoke to was helping me up in Palatka, telling me about the operations there, said they had many logs that came to that mill that would not go through there. And they would have to go out and drill holes up and down the log and set dynamite in them and split them so that they would come into the mill. Now, this is one of the carriages for a smaller log. You see that fellow sitting back there? Now he's one of the higher paid men in the mill. Now that wasn't a great lot of money. He made $1.50, maybe $3 a day was his salary. Common labor got paid $1 a day. And he could make or break a mill in any sawmill, whether it be Wilson's or any little mill out in the woods anywhere, because he made the most lumber get out of a log that could be gotten out of it by the way he sawed it. And that's why he was so valuable to the company, because he could do that. Now this fellow here is running the carriage for him. And he had another man that helped him, and he would roll the log over, put it into position for him to saw it. Now he squared that log up. Now he's not going to cut any boards off of it, because he's got it in position now for it to go through another machine. And that's this machine right here. They put that log then goes into the squared log goes into this machine. You can see all the blades right here. You can see what a big log it would take. But these are all blades here that's moving all the time, sawing. Here's what it looks like when it comes out the other end. See, all the boards have been cut now. In one swipe, he's cut all that boards out. Now you can see how wide this one was that went through there. That was a pretty good sized log that come out of there. Now this is probably the next most important man in the mill. Now he see all these pipes and things coming out. They can tell him what to do. He's looking down below at these boards you see here. Now right down below him, what he's operating is these cutoff saws. As a board comes down, he looks at that board. If he sees any knots in it or any rotten places, he has to saw that off to get it out of the way. That's why some of the boards will not come out 16 foot. That's what they normally would like to have them be. But in some cases, he can't. Now, Wilson did not sell any imperfected lumber. Now, the Pecky cypress that we call it today was a throwaway. It was not kept at that time because nobody wanted it. It was all pure, beautiful cypress lumber. Now, this lumber was all what they call red tidewater cypress. It was still a bald cypress, but if it was growing along a river where salt water would get into the river, it took on a reddish hue to it, and it was said to be a much better lumber than the cypress that grew out in the ponds and stuff where the salt water never got to it. So it had this pretty red color to it. When it come out of the for his cutter, it would come on these conveyors here, and it came along, and they were checked. It was checked again for any imperfections or anything wrong with it. You see this fella here, he's pulling it off, and they're stacking it over here now. He's doing the same thing here. He's running it, taking it off the conveyor, and they're stacking it. If you look on the end of these logs, the boards here, they're all stamped Wilson Cypress Company on the ends of them. And all that Cypress Company had their own stamp. Now, this, I got a call a few years ago from a man in San Antonio, Texas. He owned the Alamo Woodworking Company out there. When SeaWorld purchased Cypress Gardens, they found one building down there completely still filled with cypress lumber. Actually, there's about 1,700 board feet of it. And they shipped it out to San Antonio, Texas to be used in the construction of the SeaWorld out there in the restaurant. They wanted to panel the restaurant with it. They got the Alamo Woodworking Company contacted them to have it dressed and made into paneling. Well, the man that owned it said, I can't do that. He said, this wood is too beautiful. Some of it was 32 inches wide, 2-inch boards, 16 foot long. He said, it'd be a sin to cut this stuff into paneling, as beautiful as it is. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do, though. Said, I'll furnish you some cypress paneling of cypress that's being cut today, but if you will let me have this lumber here for my own self. They thought about it a little bit and said, well, you'll have to put at least one of these boards in the place. So they agreed, and he did furnish them the wood. Now, I was out there in 1979, and I went to his place, and he showed me this lumber. Had it way back up in the back of his storage sheds. He didn't want nobody to see it because he was afraid somebody would want to buy it. He said his wife told him, said, you'll die with this lumber because you'll never sell it. He said, I just like to come back here and look at it and feel it. You never see this lumber no more. That's the end of it. And he said, it's just absolutely gorgeous. But he said, I'll tell you one thing. I've given one piece of it away. And it was laying out in the front with another piece of cypress. It was real red. And he said that was a sinker out of the Rio Grande River that was cut out of. And those two boards were going to be used to make 2 new front doors for the Alamo. So if you go in the Alamo today, I'll tell you, you'll probably walk through a door that maybe the cypress that in that door grew right here on the St. Johns River, right where you live at on the St. Johns. But that was the only board he said he was going to get rid of. And there's a fellow, he's getting it crated up there, getting ready to go outside with it. Because it's going to be air dried now for over a year before they sell it. And that's the machine that picks it up and moves it. And they still use these in the Northwest and the lumber industry out there. I thought it was a homemade rig when I first saw it, but it isn't. That's a factory-made rig to use especially for just hauling lumber. And this is where they carried it outside to be stacked out in the yards. And they had 20 acres there floored with cypress lumber. They did not have concrete or asphalt. They would take the second grade or the Pecky cypress. They would take it, and it'd be about 4 inches thick, and they would take it out there and just laid it down, made a floor out of it. And they'd haul this cypress out all over it and stack on it, and if one of them broke, they'd just pull it out and drop another piece in the place of it. When they closed up, they pulled all that out and sold it because it was too valuable to leave there anymore. And this is what it looked like. You can see the rough old cypress floor out there in the yard here where this was laid, and this lumber was stacked out there. 25% of the lumber they cut was used in Florida. The rest of it was shipped out all over the world. And this is over at Shamrock at the Putnam Lumber Company over there. And this shows the machine. You can look at the size of these boards here that were coming out of there. Now, they cut lumber also, Wilson did, over in Dixie County and Lafayette County. As, they had holdings over in there that they were cutting lumber. But most of it was transported by rail over to Palatka to be sawed. Now, that's a stacker. You can see this machine here that lay the boards on here, and they'd go up and go around and come down, and there'd be men standing up there, and they would take the boards off and stack them, and they'd put boards in between them. And these boards in between them would let the air filter through there. Now you can see it right here. You see the little board, the end is sticking out, and that's to leave an air hole in there. It's about 3/4 to an inch thick, and that's where the air would circulate through them to dry them. And these fellows here are stackers, and they're stacking those things up. Here's just some of it stacked along the railroad track. Now, if you had this stack of lumber today, you would never have to worry about winning no lottery, because there's enough money there that you could never spend what that pile of lumber there would bring you today. It didn't bring that much back then, but of course at inflated prices today, it's worth a lot of money. These are some of the products that was exhibited that they were manufactured out of the Cypress. This was at one of the fairs there in Putnam County. And notice these with the hollow holes in them. These were used by telephone companies for cable, to carry cable in. And I have a piece of one of these that came out off of one of the bridges in Daytona when they replaced the bridge. But that's where the telephone cables that went across the river. And, in the early days, they made water lines out of these too, but of course not in recent years, not since they invented the galvanized pipe. But before that, they did. One of the biggest uses for it was these shingles here that you see. And also, they made butter barrels out of them and lard barrels out of cypress. Now, these are laths here for plastering. They sold these up in Palatka. Most of it, in fact, in this part of Florida, was manufactured right there in Palatka. And they would take these laths and nail them up and leave about a 3/8 of an inch space between them, or 1/2 inch. And when they put the plaster on there, they'd mush through it and kind of bulb out on the other side, and that's what held it to the wall. And if you tear down an old house today, this is what you go behind the plaster. They also mixed horsehair in it, or in some cases they put dried Spanish moss into the plaster to give it strength so it wouldn't crack too easy. And this is a fellow hand-making shingles. Cypress was great for making shingles with, because it was so straight-grained that the shingles would just come out perfect every time. They were it was just a wonderful wood for making shingles out of it. And then some of the old houses today, under their tin roofs, you'll find these old shingle roofs still. If you go up in the attic, you'll see the shingles still on the houses. They were never removed. This is the Tillman shingle mill there in Palatka. This is along with his other mill, his regular sawmill. He had a shingle mill there that they made shingles commercially there, because it took a lot of them to roof a house, and a man just cutting them by hand, he'd take him too long to make very many shingles. And this is Selden's Cypress Door Factory, which was across the street from the mill. And this now is a furniture factory there called Florida Furniture. It's in the place of this where this mill used to sit, this door factory. Many doors in the houses in this area are still made out that you'll find were made right here. Now, these were the lumber schooners that came up from to Palatka to haul out this lumber. Now, that three-masted schooner would haul 700,000 Ford feet of lumber on it. They could only put 300,000 on the boat because of the shallowness of the river. They would put 400,000 board feet on a lighter or a little raft in behind it, and then the tugboat would pull the schooner and the raft out into deep water and at the mouth of the river at Jacksonville, and stevedores would unload the lighters onto these boats. And then the tugboat would pull the lighters back to Palatka to be loaded and used again. One of these boats was in the First World War, had a load of lumber going to Nova Scotia with it. And this is what the gentleman told me there at Palatka, and he said it was torpedoed by a German submarine, and it was just like torpedoing a cork. It wouldn't go nowhere. It just sit there, and they just knew the submarine would surface and just blow them out of the water. So they were preparing to abandon ship, and sure enough, the submarine surfaced, and they sit out there a while watching them. And I guess they couldn't figure out why it wouldn't sink. So they just submerged and went on their way, and he patched the boat up, and they made it on the Nova Scotian with it. And this is the only four-masted schooner that ever came up there. This was called the Smith, and it hauled 1 million board feet of lumber on it, and it, again, could only put 300,000 on it, and the other 700,000 had to be put on lighters and pulled behind it till it got out to deep water. And this is the little tugboat that operated around at the mill there to pushing the logs around and doing whatever else that they needed done in the water out there. The Cypress was the name of it, aptly named. This was their dredge boat. This is the only one they owned, and it had to work a lot around the mill at Palatka because the bark would keep falling off of these log rafts, and eventually it would get to be so shallow out there they couldn't get the boats around in there, so they would have to go in and dredge the channel back out again. The river up there still has a lot of boards laying in the bottom of it from where wind would blow them off in a windstorm into the river, and they'd sink out there. But it's just not, the salvage work would be too great to be profitable. We're going to leave Palatka now, and we're going to head upriver. If you remember, the St. John's flows to the north. It starts down way south at Helen Blazes and comes to the north and empties out in Jacksonville, a journey of about 310 miles. This is up Dunn's Creek. And Dunn's Creek is a creek that runs from the St. John's River over into Lake Crescent. And this stand of cypress trees there is pretty indicative of what the St. John's River used to look like all over. The one section of that land around Lake Crescent was never cut. The man did not sell it to Wilson or nobody else. And it's being preserved by the family today, and they said they hope it'll never have to be sold. The largest cypress tree in the world today exists down in Longwood between Sanford and Orlando. And it's out on a highway, just a road right off of Highway 17 called the Big Tree Road. This parcel was bought by a state senator and presented to the county back in the 1920s, was dedicated by Calvin Coolidge to be preserved. This tree is 127 feet high. It was actually taller than that until 1926 when a hurricane blew the top out of it. And that, of course, is still green, still living. The top being gone did not kill it. It's 35 feet around it, and it's 17 and a half foot in diameter. It makes it the largest cypress tree in the United States. It's a pond cypress. It is not a red tidewater cypress. It's still a bald cypress, but it's listed as a pond cypress because it does not grow on the river. This gentleman is standing beside a tree that was not uncommon on the St. Johns River, and it's getting ready to be girdled and killed. And that's what this fellow right here is going to do. He's wading around in that water, and he's going ahead of the cutters about 1 year, and he's going to kill the tree. If you look up there, you'll see where there's some cuts on it. We'll see some more of them in a minute. But he's been over there girdling that tree. He kills the cambium layer of the tree, and that caused the tree to die. Now, if he misses one little spot and that tree lives for an extra month or 2 months before it finally surrenders and dies, it could leave enough moisture in it that when they cut it and get it in the river, it'll sink. And those are called sinkers. And the river is full of those sinkers, and we'll talk about them some more in a few minutes. Now, there he is. He's the same gentleman. He's up there on the side of the tree. He's standing up on a board he's put up there. Now, the cypress tree has got a bell bottom to it. It's much, much bigger where it goes into the ground than it is up just a few feet above the ground. That's to give it support. And all those little knees that stick up around a cypress tree are not going to be the little cypress trees. Those are trees that come off the roots, and they help the tree to breathe. And that's what their nature put them there for. Now, you can see this fellow. You have a hard time seeing him, but there's a man standing right over there, and he has just finished girdling that tree right there to kill it. And he'll probably move over onto this one next. just finished girdling that tree. But he tries to get up as high as he can above that bell, because that's just a lot of sawing for so little wood that when they saw the tree down, they get above the bell to make their cut. And this is not an unusual sized tree back when they were cutting on the St. John. This was just a normal tree. It really is. I won't say it's little, but I asked that gentleman I talked to up there what the average size tree that came through that mill was. And he said, I would guess that the average size tree was probably 7 foot in diameter. There's some smaller trees in there. Now, these lands along the river were bought mostly from the state of Florida. And because most of the river swamp was owned by the state at that time. And this was in the 1920, from the early 1900s right on up until 1944, when Wilson closed up operations. They owned a lot of land, but most of the land the state owned, they did not buy. They bought it by stumpage. In other words, they paid for it by the tree. When they got through cutting in the area, the state man, along with one of Wilson's people, would walk through and they would count the number of stumps that was there, and that's what they paid for. Anywhere from 50 cents to $1.50 per stump was what they paid for these trees.
That's a big old knee.
It sure is. About as big as I've ever seen. You really can't tell how big it is until you put a person beside of it. What's funny about this tree is it didn't cut it all the way around. It's not cut around here with the axe. He evidently got that far and decided it was hollow, because you can hear the axe probably making a sound against a hollow tree, and he quit. And he never went any further than what you saw right there, but yet it killed the tree. Yeah. Eventually it died. Probably took it a long time after they were in here for it to die, but it finally died. Did you see where he cut?
Yeah,
And that's
some
only
notches up there.
Huh?
Some notches up there too.
Yeah. He finally realized the thing was hollow, and he quit. But he done cut enough to kill the tree. They didn't have to cut in very far to kill it.
Yeah.
The Camden layer is all that has to be cut. It's just that outside Camden layer, and it's killed it. I'm sure glad we noticed this tree up in here. Now, this fella here is sharpening his saws because he's going to go out there to work. You notice he's got a spare laying right there. Now, you can imagine if you're cutting a 20-foot tree or a 10-foot tree that you're going to have long saws, but you can't start off with a 15-foot saw, because it would be so shaky you'd never get it going. So they would start off with a small saw, a shorter saw, and as it got to the point where it had to lengthen, they would just start using bigger and bigger saws. And that's what they why they had to have so many different saws with them every day. Now these fellas, you see, is way up above the bell of that tree doing their sawing. But look over behind this gentleman here, and you'll see a cable. It's wrapped around that tree. That's a skidder cable. It's going to pull these logs out of the swamp. And we'll talk about them some more in a few minutes. There's some fellas cutting. They're cutting right in the cut mark where the man killed the tree. They're right in the cut mark. Now, not only did they have to cut the tree down, but then they had to limb it up. And that's what these fellas are doing. They're limbing it up. And it wasn't much limbing to cut. That's just brush there most it fell on. But then they cut it up into 32-foot lengths to be hauled out of there, pulled out. Or sometimes the tree was big enough, they'd make it into add 16 more foot to the length of it. Now that's the dredge that we saw up at Palatka as he's headed south down the river, because they had no way to get these things out of the trees out of these swamps, because a mule or ox or any kind of machinery could not operate in there. So there wasn't but one thing to do. They had to dredge canals all over that river back in there, so they could get up in those canals with their skidders to pull it out, to get them to the river to be formed into rafts. And there is probably down at Blue Spring area. There's must be at least 5 canals that connect between the St. Johns River and Hontoon Dead River, as well as one that go even further past Hontoon Dead River. Now the skidders could pull those logs for as much as a mile, so these canals had to be close enough together so that they would be able to reach in and get all the cypress. And when they got to an area where they could build a railroad in there, then they didn't have to dig canals. Now these were about 25 foot wide, too, these canals were, to begin with. And this is a labor boats they're pulling down, and this is going through the bridge at DeLand, at the Crow's Bluff Bridge. And they're headed down with these labor boats that we see here in this picture. Now these are anchored along the river, and there's one of them was a foreman's boat, the supervisor, the woods supervisor, who got paid $150 a month. He was the highest paid man out there besides the superintendent. One of them was for the white help, and one of them was for the black help that lived in these boats. And they'd go in there on Sunday evening, and they'd stay till Friday afternoon. They'd bring them back in to the landing, and then they could usually live right in that area someplace, and they worked. Common labor got $1 a day. Some of the other men made as much as $1.50. The man that operated the skidder got $5 a day. He was supposed highest paid man out there. Even railroad locomotive engineers only got about $3 a day. There's one of the skidders operating there up in the creek. When you go down these old canals today, you'll see little things dug off to the side, and that's where these skidders would set up in to pull those logs out. This is probably one of the very first airboats that was ever on the St. Johns River. And Mr. Abel Bro Sr. and his family came here from Louisiana to be the field superintendent for Wilson Cypress Company in this Central Florida area here doing this logging, because he did that out in Louisiana, and they persuaded him to come here and operate. And I say he ran all over in this little airboat. And that's a tugger right there. That's the skidder or tugger, and he's got 3 rolls of cable on there. There's a 1/2-inch cable, 5/8 inch cable, and a 7/8 inch cable. The 2 smaller ones would contain 2 miles of cable on it. The big one only contained 1 mile of cable, and that's as far as that big one could reach in there, would be 1 mile, and pull a log out. And then when he got ready to pull a log, when they let him know no radio contact then, they just had to come in, I guess, and tell him that or send word along mouth to mouth that they had it hooked up and he could pull it out. And he would blow his whistle so many times to let the people know that he was fixing to start pulling, so nobody would be in the way in case that cable broke, because it'd cut you in half just like a razor. And I'm sure there was a lot of men killed out there in that swamp, and a lot of them really badly injured out there. OSHA would not go along with that today. There's a little operator on the Ocklawaha, probably, or maybe up on the Wekiva, and they would cut and sell to the bigger companies, and they would lease a little piece of property, or they would buy stumpage and resell after they got it cut and brought into the river where it could be Wilson and them could pick it up. And on this one here, you can see the rolls of cable on this tugger here. And this is a little lithograph again of the log being pulled out of the swamp. And you see the tugger sitting up here, and the logs that's coming out. And this fella here with a PV hook, because he's having to work these logs around to get them in position to be formed into a raft. And there's one coming out of the swamp. Now, if you look, you don't see any big ones as far as you can see, because they start at the shore and work inland and take them out as it's coming to them, so they won't be in the way when they pull the others out of there. And there's one on the Ocklawaha River, and you can see it's pulled it out now, and it's bobbing around there in the river. getting ready to be put into a raft. And this is a raft that they're working on here, one of the rafts. And that fellow in the middle, he's probably the superintendent of the raft construction. He gets $1.50 a day, and the other two men get $1 a day for what they're doing. All these logs are tied together with these logs, a small piece of wood here. They would tie them together with a piece of wire about not quite as big around as a pencil, steel wire. They had a log that went around the outside of it, as you can see in some of the later pictures, that kind of held the raft together. But that wire was wired, each one of them, up to that thing. If it become a sinker and wanted to sink, they would just take an axe and just cut that wire and let it fall to the bottom, because it would disturb the raft too bad to have one that was trying to sink all the time pulling on the raft. So they would just drop it in the river and let it go. Now these rafts, the ones on the Ocklawaha, were only about 500 feet long. They were not that long, and they were in sections of usually about 32 feet sections, so that it could turn and twist. And they were hinged together with another log, as we can see in a minute. Now the ones on the St. John's, they were longer and bigger, and the whole raft would usually be about 750 feet long, and the Homer would pull it out of there. And this is a pine log raft here that going to another mill. But see how it's hinged together here, and that's got a bolt down in there so that they can twist as they go around the curves. And the men rode these rafts. They walked them all the time, and with a pole, and they could push it off the bank so it wouldn't get log jammed up on the bank. And the Ocklawaha, a lot of it was swift enough that they could just let it float like this one is being floated here. But eventually they would have to hook a little tugboat on it and pull it on up to Palatka. The pine log did not go to Wilson. We'll see where they go in a few minutes. Now this is in the canal again, and you can see the log raft that's been made up in there. It's not very wide, because the canal's not very wide, only 25 foot. But it would be carried up later, further up the river, to be joined in with a big raft. And this fellow out there working, he's tying them logs together there, tying them up to the piece that runs across that holds the whole raft together. And you go out there today, you won't see this. These things are all smoothed down, these banks are today, and it's grown over with a canopy of trees. It's like almost like going down a tunnel today. Very beautiful. After Wilson abandoned these canals and through working in them, the water hyacinth was so thick in the river that these canals just jammed completely up with them as far as you could see. And they had a beautiful blossom on them, and this is what people, why they're here today, because of the beauty of the flower attracted people. And they came in here by Mrs. Fuller, who threw them in the St. John River and created this big glory of beautiful flowers, but it was also one of the worst navigation hazards they could have in the river. That's all gone today. They sprayed them, killed them, and today you can navigate one of these very easily, and some of the others by canoe or a very small boat, because there's too many trees fell across it. This fellow's name here is Abel Brode Jr. His father was the superintendent of all the woods crews. Now, Abel operated a little small tugboat that pulled the little raft out of the canals up to near the Whitehair Bridge at 44, Highway 44, where they would make up the big raft that was going to be pulled on up to Palatka. And Abel later went to as an armed guard on the merchant marine ships going to Murmansk, and he made that run at least 2 times, I think, and it was and he survived it, which was very rare to make that many trips, that Murmansk run. And this little boat here is called the Bodunk. He's being used here to shove these logs around in the river here to get the raft made up, because you can see the cables laying out here on the thing that's going back to the boat, and he's pulling logs and pushing around there to get the raft made up. And this was, like I said, took over 700 foot of the shoreline just south of the Whitehair Bridge there to 44 on the east side of the river, and that's where they made that big raft up that was going to go to Palatka. And there it is right there being made up along the bank. That fellow's working there with his cables, getting it all tied up and ready to go. Now, the biggest cypress tree that they ever cut up along that Blue Springs area was said to have been 25 foot in diameter. Took them 3 days to saw it down. And it went up about 50 feet and it forked. And the two forks were 10 foot in diameter. And when the tugger couldn't pull it out of the swamp. It was too big and too heavy. So they had to take and set the dynamite in it and blast it in half. And then they pulled the two halves out and put them in the river and then the canal. And they filled that canal. Each half was almost completely as wide as a canal. So it didn't take much of that to make a raft on its own. And this is the Homer. Now you see he's pulling the log raft behind him right there. And he's the one that pulled. Now he had to go through 2 bridges with this raft. He had to go through the the Crow's Bluff Bridge in there at 44 before the Whitehair Bridge was built. And he also had to go through the bridge up at Astor. And that had to be a tricky maneuver to bring a log raft of 700 and something foot long through those openings in that bridge because they weren't very wide. Of course, as I said, a lot of times they had men on those rafts with poles to help keep it off of there. And that's just a side view of the Homer. This was a nice tugboat. I saw it a many a time going up and down that river as a kid. And this is a little boat here. And he's towing some pine logs out of the Ocklawaha, and he's towing them up to Browning's mill across the river from Wilson. Now Wilson did not cut much pine wood until later years. They started cutting in the late 1930s. They started cutting pine, and they cut a lot of pine also before they went out, but not at Palatka. That was strictly a Cypress mill there. But they had some other mills that we'll talk about in a minute that they cut a lot of pine and maple and other types of wood. And this is that little tugboat pulling that those pine logs just going to the Browning's mill in Palatka, in East Palatka actually. Now these pine had a bad tendency to want to sink. So what they would do is they'd take these 55-gallon drums and they would tie them all along the side, on both sides of the raft, and that would help hold those pine logs up because they were not like the cypress. The pine wouldn't drain out the moisture out of it because it was hard pine and it was just like it was fat lightered inside and it was hard as a rock. So they had a real problem with them trying to sink all the time. And this is the Browning's mill, which is across the river. Now, Browning did not have lumber crews like Wilson did. He bought his lumber, his timber, from private contractors. They would go out and cut, and he would buy their logs from them rather than have his own cutting crews. As I said, when they got where they could build railroads into the places, that's what they did, and that's what they're doing here. They're building a railroad into some of their property that they own. And one of the biggest places they purchased was what we call today Seminole Springs over in Lake County. It's on Blackwater Creek, and that was a large tract of land that Wilson owned. And finally, after they timbered it, they sold it to the Strawn family, which still owns it today. And it's one of the most pristine pieces of ground left in central Florida. It contains everything in the wildlife you can think of, including panthers. And it's one day will hopefully become part of the state's property and preserved, and rather than turned into a lot of subdivision. That's what we hope for anyhow. You can see in the background here, you see a car loaded with cross ties. And these fellows driving piling across the swamp when the train just builds its own railroad as it goes. There's an old picture here. This is a very... he's got a piling there. That's what they're doing, is driving piling to build his railroad with. And there you can see he's out in front building this railroad along there, and these fellows laying ties, and he's having to build everything because it's a complete swamp. But Wilson had 8 locomotives when they went out of business, steam locomotives and 2 gasoline locomotives. They had a fine railroad. The first railroad trains they bought, the trains came off the elevated streetcar system in New York City. And then they started buying them brand new from the Baldwin Company. And this is just showing how the bridge is supported. And this old bridge here, Wilson had built good railroads. And when they got through with one, they just took the rail up and he reused it, and the rest of it they left there. You can see the old track going down through here. It was pretty. Well, wasn't the straightest track in the world, but it served the purpose of what they needed. And you can see a little motor car coming along. Now, he could not follow one of those trains that came through with the logs, because he's going to spread that track enough that motor car won't stay on it. They have to realign it. After the train goes through full of logs, they have to realign that track to get it back where it belonged. Now, they didn't use anything but standard gauge railroads. That was so that they could get on railroads owned by the Florida East Coast Railroad or whoever was in the area, plants, or Jacksonville, Key West, Tampa Railroad. But they did not buy narrow gauge railroad cars. Everything was standard gauge. And when they got into these areas where they're using trains to load them, they would have one big spar tree, and you see this spar tree here, and somewhere out in that swamp, maybe a half a mile or a quarter of a mile away, whatever it was, usually somewhere in that area, they would put another cable right in the top of that. They'd cut the tops out of the trees, and they would anchor these off, and you can see those pulleys there. The small cables would go out, and they'd pick up a log and pull them in on that. They just ride in like a elevated railroad coming in there. You can see they're pulling. He may be pulling 3 or 4 different directions at one time. So there's one there coming in, there's one laying over sliding in. So they came from all different directions at one time, and this was a much more efficient thing. They had at one time, they had 800 of these cars here, these lumber cars for the railroad. Wilson was a very big operation. It was a large operation. This just shows you some of the cables and where the skidder's working off of that spar tree that they left to do that with. This is another lithograph showing the same type of thing. You see all the cables running off of here. They just look like maybe a dozen or more of them running in all directions, so they can pull at any time. They can pull all of them at one time even. Won't hurt anything. As long as that steam engine right there can build up enough steam to pressure to do the job that they need to do. That's all they needed. This again is showing the skidder working. You see the top of the spar now is cut out, and you can see the cables real good in this picture. And there's one of the cables running there, one of the pulleys on this one. And you see the people standing up here, and there's a log coming in, and there's a man standing up on that log, which OSHA would never approve today. But they'd ride it in. There's a man standing on that one coming in. I guess they thought it was big fun back then to be able to ride on top of that coming in there. Look at this picture closely. You see the man standing up there on the log coming in, and this fellow standing here. And what I want to show you, this is a black and white picture. That's the same picture in color. This is on a postcard. Same men standing there, same places. We owe the people, the old photographers, a real debt of gratitude for what they did back in the old days. What they did was go out and take pictures of everything they could think of that a postcard company might want. And they would send all of them to these postcard companies, and if they decided to use it, they would give them $10 for it. And that's the reason today, one of the main reasons today we have so many fine photographs back in the 1890s and the early 1900s of everything in the whole United States is because of the people wanting to sell to postcard companies. And this is where we found a lot of pictures that are just like the postcards, only they're not the same picture. If this man may be moved slightly, because he probably took 2 or 3 pictures of this. One of them the postcard company bought, and the other one we have found the picture, but they're almost identical because they were taken at the same time. Now this is a topographical photograph of the land area north of Lake Norris over in Lake County, where Sir Wilson had worked through there. And what you're seeing here is where the skidders were. These little white spots was everywhere they set up a skidder at. the steam skidders to pull the logs out of the swamps with, and you can see them as they come out of the lake there. They went all up into there. And this is the way it was all over Lake County and all over anywhere that they were cutting and using railroads to get their material out. They'd had to set up these skidders, and it just killed, they destroyed all the vegetation around it. They beat it down with the logs to where it was a long time ever coming back, and the lines in between it is where the railroad run. That was the tracks, was where the lines in between the white dots. This is one of their engines they had bought from Baldwin. You can see it's a wood-burning engine because of the stack on it. These were put on there, those big old stacks, to suppress the sparks so that they wouldn't set the woods on fire everywhere they went. When this later went over to coal, they were able to go to a different type, just straight up and down chimney to let out the smoke because it didn't create the fire problem that the old wood engine did. This is over in Seminole Springs area that we talked about on the Weak Ivan Blackwater Creek area. And you can see these two engines here, and the spur line that run off from it is going back into the here. And they're bringing the lumber out. And these old cow catchers here, because cattle were allowed to roam anywhere they wanted to back up until after the Second World War. And the trains all had these cow catchers on it, so that the cow get up under the engine and derail it. This thing was curved and pitched the cow off to one side or the other instead of derailing the train. And there's one of the trains coming out of the swamp loaded with logs. You look at that fellow right there sitting up on the front. He's got his suit on. He's got a tie and a shirt and everything. He has probably just quit. And he's got his good suit on. He's going out of there, and he's going to go someplace else and go to work, and don't have to work in that swamp no more. But this, I assume that's what he was doing anyhow. But notice the cow catcher is built again to get them off the track out of their way, or anything else that got on the track. It would pitch it off instead of going up under the engine. This little train here was the third engine that Wilson bought, and so they called it the three-spot. And you can see it's loaded up with logs coming out of the swamp there. And that's it again. That's the three-spot. Notice the size of those logs he's carrying back there. They're big fellers. There's one of them right there that's loaded on a car. It's on just two logs on this little one and this big one here, and that's probably enough lumber in there to make a house today, a fairly nice house today. This is Wilson Cypress's camp on the St. John River just south of White here at a place called Hawkinsville. This was a community here at one time in its history back in the late 1800s. It's no longer nothing there today except 2 or 3 houses and a cattle farm. But this logs are coming in from over at Blackwater, where we just saw them with the train operation, and they're being pulled in there to be dumped in the river. And that's the laborers' houses over there that lived on the property. And he's coming along here. They're going out into the water now on an elevated area across the lake so they can dump those cypress logs into the river. And this is at Drager's Mud Lake, which is named for my great-uncle Jesse Dragers. And there's the train again. You noticed again that the train is elevated. That one side's higher than the other, so these logs will roll off into the water with very little help, hopefully with no help, but sometimes it'd be crooked enough it would have to have a little help to get it off of there. And you notice on the side it says Wilson Cypress, and this is right there still at Hawkinsville, and they're dumping into the river there because it's just right across the lake and up down the river just a little piece to where that big raft's at that's going to be made up to go to Jacksonville. That's why the raft was made up right in this area, because they could get all of Cypress coming out of Blackwater as well as up around Blue Springs into the one central location to make the raft up. And there's again, you can see Wilson Cypress, and then the tilt in those cars so that it's rolling off. This is some machinery being unloaded there at Hawkinsville because it's going over to the pine mill on Blackwater Creek over there. That's just a little short ways from here. And that mill will be set up over there to cut pine. And this is the mill at Blackwater. This is a pine mill only. This was all sawed here and shipped out by rail over to Eustis, and from there it was distributed all over the country. This at one time employed almost 300 people here at this mill until they finally cut all the timber out of Blackwater, and that ended the operation there. You can still see signs of it today over there. When you're driving along going to Eustis, you look over on your left after you pass through Cassia and go across Blackwater Creek. You'll see where the railroad bed was at and where this mill used to sit at. And this is the commissary there at Wilson's. And Wilson was one of the few life companies that paid off in U.S. currency. Their employees all got U.S. currency. A lot of the sawmills and most turpentine stills in Florida paid off with their own money. They made up tokens of either out of aluminum or they paid off in paper money, redeemable only at the company store. But here they got U.S. currency, and this is payday. They're lined up outside there, and they were getting their check, their cash. They didn't pay them in checks; they gave them cold cash, and they could spend their money anywhere. This is one of Wilson's other smaller places. Wilson also had an operation in Costa Rica, as well as in the United States. But this was one of the smaller pine mills again. They were cutting pine in the later years that they were in operation, and this one small pine mill. Now here's a little old bitty mill. These were called coffee pot mills or thick and thin mills. Now this was not owned by Wilson. This was owned by just somebody who's just got a little tract of land there logging. They bought the timber off of it. And what they meant by the coffee pot was that there was a steam-operated mill, and the boiler was so small it wasn't much bigger than a coffee pot. And when they said thick and thin, it was because the saws were usually so worn and worn out practically that when you run a board through it, it would either come out 3/4 of an inch or maybe a half an inch or an inch. You never know what size the board was going to be, so they called them thick and thin mills. And notice that old sawdust pile there. And those old sawdust piles were all over the woods back when I was a kid, in the flat woods and everywhere. And after the war, the nurseries started wanting that sawdust, and they went out and dug every one of them out that they could find to bring in to use in their nurseries. And you don't see that anymore. You can't find a sawdust pile no place in the woods anymore. It's either been done that way, or it's rotted away, or it's caught fire and burned up. This is a little operation on the Wekiva River, off of the St. Johns, and they cut a lot of cypress along that too. But this was a smaller company, not owned by Wilson. This is the Osceola Cypress Company down on Lake Harney, on the south end of the river, up in the upper reaches of the river. And this was a large cypress mill also, and a very good friend of the Wilsons, the man that owned this was. And they operated here for quite a few years. And you can see their operation was very large too. They had nice railroad trains running in there, and pretty big yards, quite a bit of lumber stacked on it drying. And this operation, when it closed up completely, all the stuff taken out of it, and eventually it returned to nature. These some good close-up pictures. You can see the material on the board stacked up under the shed here. These are two friends of mine, George Scott and another friend here, and they're out in that same area today, what you just saw, looking for artifacts. They're mostly hunting for old bottles. And what has happened, they found an old saw there, and this is one of the saws they used it to cut the logs with. But it's completely gone back to nature in there. As I said today, nature has a way of reclaiming its own if you let it alone. This was Dowling's mill up at Green Cove Springs. Now, we don't think of cypress much being harvested up there, but the cypress grew all the way up to the mouth of the St. John, so it was all up in this area too. And this was one of the larger mills, and when it first started out was up at Green Cove. In fact, Wilson's actually started cutting just south of Green Cove when they first started cutting on the St. Johns River. This is one of the large plants over at Apalachicola. They harvested a lot of timber in the panhandle up there, because Louisiana was where most of the cypress, or the biggest portion of the cypress, was at besides Florida. And this is the raft coming in there. You can see And this gives you a good idea of the boom. See how the outer layer of logs are fitted to hold these things together. So that, and they were called booms, and that's what kept them herded up almost like a herd of cattle. After the Second World War, Wilson shut down in 1944 because he couldn't get help. The Navy bases opened up here in DeLand, and other things opened up here, the boat works and all, and they were paying common labor 40 cents an hour, where they'd been making $1 a day out here working 10 hours or 12 hours a day. Now they all quit this, and they wasn't near as hard to go in and work in these other places. So Wilson ceased operations in 1944, cutting of the wood. And they kept their mineral rights on a lot of the land they owned. In fact, they kept the mineral rights up probably until the 1970s before the last of the mineral rights were sold, and Wilson Cypress officially closed up all their businesses. Now, Mr. Stubbs came down here from Georgia, and after the war, he'd been cutting pine up there, and it played out. And he came down here, and some of the land that Wilson didn't cut on the other side of Pontoon Island in that area, and up around Lake Woodruff, they went to the state and they bid on this timber in there. I think he said they paid $1.50 a tree for it, and they got that lumber, and they started a little mill right there near Pontoon Island State Park. And this was their railroad engines, the old Packard automobiles, what it actually is, fitted with railroad wheels to pull their logs out with. And you see the railroad wasn't very much, but it served their purpose, and that's all that really mattered. And this is where the railroad, the mill was set up at, over on the peninsula side of the river. That's the mouth of Pontoon River, Dead River, right there that you're looking at. And this is a little thing that bring the logs out of the river and lay them up here to be ready to get to go in the mill. This is their labor truck. And they would bring their people, they'd pick up their labor every morning downtown, bring them out here and work them all day and carry them home at night. So they didn't have to house them anywhere. And this is one of their little rafts that's coming in there. This is the mouth of the Pontoon Dead River right up here. This is the main river, the St. Johns. Now, they cut everything over there. They cut gum and pine, anything they could find over there to make lumber out of, they cut it. They didn't just cut the cypress. This is showing the mill from the river. That's the little mill they had up there in the drag line. This is just showing some of their lumber, the logs they brought in there. You can see the logs laying here. There's some pine there, and this is cypress coming in here. But they cut maple, red maple out of the swamp maple. Anything that would make lumber, they cut it. This is one of their bigger cypress trees that they cut and brought in there. And that's Mr. Moses. He's the man that operated the drag line for them. And this fella here, it's hard to see him standing there. He's standing beside one of the bigger cypress logs that they brought in there. Now, this saw here is a little different than what we saw in any of the other things. This had a double saw. There's one above and one below. They did not mesh together. One was ahead of the other one, so they wouldn't hit each other. But you can see it's cut on both sides as it goes through there, so that it's going to fall off when that board is, when it gets over right in here. But this was a different type saw. This was also a replaceable tooth saw, so that they didn't have to replace the whole blade when the teeth wore out. This is just some of the little planer mills and stuff they had in the mill. It was, like I said, it was a very small mill, and they stacked a lot of lumber out there in the yard, especially Pecky cypress. It just windrowed out there outside of the mill, and when they closed up, there was just several hundred feet of it stacked up out there, and growed up in grapevines and briars and stuff. You couldn't even see the lumber out there. But all of a sudden, people wanted Pecky cypress to panel their Florida rooms with. And they went out there and run the snakes and the yellow jackets out of there, and they cut all that brush away from it and them vines. And they dug all that stuff out. It was still good, and sold every piece of it. This is just some of the other little equipment, the little planer mills and stuff in there, and the cut-off saws inside the mill. Back in the 60s, some of the fellows that lived around on the river decided that they ought to get into the business of getting those sinkers up, because the river had a lot of sinkers in it, still does. And they would go down the river with a long piece of rod, and they'd probe along where they thought there might be some. When they found one, they would they'd dive down to it and get a cable under it, and they'd lash a barrel to it. It had air things on it, and they'd take and blow all the water out of it and fill it with air, and they'd put enough of those barrels on there, it'd make that thing pop to the top. And they could drag it down here. That's the White Hair Bridge in the background at the Crow's Bluff. And they would drag it down here, and they would sell them. And they would the amount of time they'd working, they wasn't making a whole lot of money. But then the state come along and said, you can't do that anymore, because if you do, we're going to have to charge you for a regular, just like that tree was standing on the land out there and you sawed it down. And Cypress had become so valuable then, it was not worth the time and all to try to do that, for what they were going to have to pay for the cypress log and then what they were getting for it. So they didn't do that for just a little while. There's some of it they'd brought up there, and then they're waiting for a man to come along, had a little mill there in the land to buy it and sew it up. Now this wood is very dark in color. It's almost chocolate brown from being in the water all those years. Still as solid as a rock, and nothing wrong with it. It'll last forever, I guess. But it still is a very unusual color because of being sunk. You can always tell a sinker board by looking at it if you know what you're looking at. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have learned a little bit about the cypress industry and the giants that grew along the St. Johns River, because indeed there were giants. I had the good fortune to live in the time when they were still on the river. I can remember my dad and I was down there fishing, and they were cutting and girdling the trees, and I asked him what they were doing to them. He said, oh, they killed them so they can cut them down. And of course, nobody thought anything about it. It was a resource that was, I guess they all thought it had been put here to use, and that's what they were going to do with it. But if you're waiting for the next generation of the cypress trees to come that's that size, you'll be old and old when it comes, because it'll take probably at least close to 1,000 years to get a tree up that big again today.